Hello, I am Dr. Paola Bella, a Wemba Wemba and Gunditjmara sovereign woman. I was raised in my community on Yorta Yorta and Wemba Wemba country and live on Bunwarang and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri country. I am the Director of Teaching and Learning at Mindani Balak Indigenous Academic Unit, Victoria University, where I'm proud to be part of the Teaching and Research Collective. My work also involves being an artist, curator and writer. Very honoured to be doing the Acknowledgement of Country and saying a few words today regarding sport for human rights. To boycott or to not boycott, is that the question? I acknowledge, honour, recognise and pay my respects to the ancestors, elders and families of the Bunwarrung, Woiwurrung Wurundjeri and Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation on our Melbourne campuses and the Gadigal and Guringai people of the Eora Nation on our Sydney campus. These groups are the custodians of university land and have been for many centuries. As we share our own knowledge practices within the university and public dialogues, may we pay respect to the deep knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal community and ownership of country. I acknowledge this country, this place, is a place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the Kulin people's living culture has a unique role in the life of this region. I also acknowledge that today is Sorry Day and recognise the pain, injustice and ongoing suffering that stolen generations, peoples and their families continue to suffer, and invite you to consider this unresolved grief for a moment. We can't consider the contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to public life, art, culture, politics or sport on the local, national and international level without considering our people in the fullness of our humanity, our suffering, our survival, our thriving and black joy, despite the odds. In thinking about sport for human rights, I think of the courage it takes for us as Indigenous people to put ourselves out there to participate in national sports and footy ovals, cricket pitches, netball and basketball courts. These places, these sports, so loved in so-called Australia, but controlled through exclusion, white dominant leadership, management, coaching, umpiring, and where Aboriginal athletes, participants and community supporters experience racism on and off the court or ground continually. To participate in sport takes courage, but to return again and again after copying racism takes enormous strength and courage that comes at a cost, either as a professional athlete or for our social or cultural well-being. Being confronted repeatedly by racism is exhausting and wears you down. Sport creates resilience and bonding, and our state Indigenous sports carnivals are often the highlight of our community calendars. But when you're a blackfella playing sport in mainstream competitions, the stakes are always stacked against you. We only have to think about Adam Goodes and Nikki Wimar to see how much courage it takes to speak out in the great game of Marngrook AFL, let alone dealing with public gaslighting campaigns that deny racism even exists, let alone in sport. And they're just the male prominent figures. I think about legendary Marcia Ella Duncan, the first Aboriginal woman to represent Australia in netball, about tennis legend Yvonne Goolagong, and most recent legend of all, Ash Barty, but also all of the unrecognised Aboriginal women, children and young people who have to battle through it and still are. We don't have to look far for examples of how we're still segregated in and out of sport. The most glaring omission right now, the greatest netballers we will never know, and not being selected for Australia at a state, national and international level. While you consider boycott and sport today, remember movements like the 1970 apartheid protest, which Professor Gary Foley, a leading scholar at Mindani Balak, was instrumental in, and the effect of that campaign, which boosted the Aboriginal rights movement, especially for land rights. At the local level, I remember all the black mums fighting to protect their kids at sport. My mum struggling to keep me in the representative netball squad I made, but where I couldn't get on the court, where I couldn't get selected by my high school team, despite being selected for the Victorian State Indigenous team 3 times. I think about my son, who's almost 18 now, giving up junior footy after being called an abo by children and parents, by patiently waiting on the bench for 3/4 to have a run, not knowing he was being punished for talking and giggling during training that week, while his white mates who did the same played 4 games. This week, while we rightfully celebrate Sir Doug Nicholls' rant and dream time at the G in Martin Cook AFL, what happens the rest of the season? Bold actions and solidarity with Aboriginal people can have life-changing impacts and gives you the opportunity to be courageous with us. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to officially welcome you all to the 2022 National Sport Integrity Forum. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. For me today, that's the Ngunnawal people. I'd also like to recognise the outstanding contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples make to society and sport in Australia, and to celebrate the power of sport to promote reconciliation and reduce inequality. I'd also like to thank our hosts, the Sport Australia Hall of Fame and Victoria University, for organising today's forum and bringing together such an impressive panel of guests to discuss this year's important topic, sport for human rights. Throughout my career in various sporting roles as an athlete and sports administrator, I've always been eager to show how sport can be used as a vehicle for positive change in society. This is not just globally, but locally in our communities across Australia, and I'm looking forward to hearing how this is viewed by our panel today. Over the coming decade, Australia will play host to an amazing array of major sporting international competitions, starting with this year's Road World Championships, Women's Basketball World Cup, the World Short Course Swimming Championships, moving on to the FIFA Women's World Cup, and of course we've secured the 2026 Commonwealth Games and the male and female Rugby World Cups for 2027 and 2029. And that's just the start of the list. This means Australia will become the epicentre of world sport over the next decade as we prepare for the Brisbane Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2032. This green and gold runway provides Australia with a great opportunity to show the world the incredible power of sport to bring people of all backgrounds together, where our athletes are united in their passion and equal on the playing field. Again, thank you for your attendance today, and well done to SAHOF Chair John Bertrand and his team and your partners at Victoria University for putting together this event. I hope you get plenty out of today's forum, and I look forward to working closely with you all on our journey to make Australian sport the world's best through to Brisbane 2032 and beyond.
Just as importantly, Lane 8 Atlanta. Who will ever forget that if you're either old enough to remember it either in person in Atlanta or indeed on television around the world. You talk about coming from behind. Still gives me goosebumps. Anyway, so welcome to the 7th National Sport Integrity Forum, Sports for Human Rights. To boycott or not to boycott, is that the question? The Sport Australia Hall of Fame is proud to be working with Victoria University, now ranked number 9 globally for sports science education. So my congratulations there. Together we've implemented 6 highly successful National Sports Integrity Forums so far, and something we're very proud of us together. These forums are a valuable tool and have been a wonderful platform in addressing the most pressing issues facing the sport industry of today. I'd like to acknowledge our partners, Sport Australia and the Australian Institute of Sport, and also Sports Cover. As of this morning, we have registered participants hailing from all states and territories from around Australia, and indeed across the globe. I'd like to extend special warm welcome to my fellow Sport Australia Hall of Fame board members, Vice Chancellor and President of Victoria University, Professor Adam Shoemaker, and President of Victoria, and members of the Victoria University Council, academics and researchers. Chris Nash, Managing Director of Sports Cover. Welcome, Chris. Brooke Delandra, General Manager, Sport Division, Australian Sports Commission, and her colleagues from the Australian Sports Commission and Sport Australia. Maddie Clements, Acting Director of the Australian Institute of Sport, and her colleagues. Cindy McLeish, MP, Shadow Minister for Sport. John Boltby, AM, CEO, National Sports Tribunal. David Hellman, Chair, Athletics Integrity Unit Board. Anne-Marie Harrison, CEO of Victoria Institute of Sport, Sean Carroll, Racing Integrity Commissioner, Brendan Schwab, Executive Director, World Players Association and Uni Global Union, and Lisa Hasker, CEO of Vic Sport, and indeed all our the Sport Australia Hall of Fame members and scholarship recipients. For some housekeeping, please submit questions in the Q&A function Vimeo. The chat platform will be moderated throughout the event, and appropriate questions will be filtered through to the moderator. For those requesting, closed captions information will be available in the event bio. Please note a recording of the live stream will be available after the event, and details will be emailed to registered guests next week. When this team came together to discuss the topic of this year's forum, human rights was an obvious choice. Our games, our athletes, our sport are all being challenged by the threat of global conflict and indeed the erosion of democracy. But is a boycott the role of sport? Does it achieve anything? Does it hinder our ability to connect and build relationships? I'd like to just throw in a case study of myself. I was involved in the 1980 boycott when Russia invaded Afghanistan. I won selection for the sailing for the international soling event in the sailing team. And we were asked by then the Fraser government to boycott. And the Australian Sailing Federation decided to boycott. As a result, my boat went to Russia, but myself and my team never went. I just spent 3 years on the campaign trail throughout Europe. And probably 3 or 4 months after the boycott, after the Olympics, I should say, 1980 Olympics, Moscow, I don't think anybody cared. Trade continued, life moved on. And I look back and I think, well, you know, what was the point of all of that? So that was athletes versus country, the way I can think about it in my own mind. Then there's another type of boycotting that's happening now, global events versus country. For example, the World Short Course Swimming Championships are going to be held now in Melbourne, Australia, instead of Russia, because of what's happening in the Ukraine. So FINA, the governing body, have decided to move the championships in protest. And the third type, global events versus athletes. Wimbledon is now banning all Russian players from competing. And of course, we have country versus country, Ukraine and Russia. Western nation states via economic boycott of Russia, the sanctions associated with it. So this is a very complex discussion that we're going to have today. And indeed, where does one draw the line? That's the question. To boycott or not to boycott? Okay, so before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to introduce Professor Ramon Spy, who will provide an overview of the construct of human rights and how this can be contextualized in the world of sport. Thank you, Ramon.
Thank you, John, for your opening comments. Also for addressing some of the layers of sport boycotts and human rights. And you asked, one of the questions you asked is, where do we draw the line when it comes to boycotts? And I would like to pick up on that particular question. And well, as we've come to expect from academics, and I say that cheekily, I would like to complicate matters a little bit further before we get into the discussion. But first, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which I sit here on the banks of the Maribyrnong River, the Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. So human rights are norms that aspire to recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. They belong to all of us, regardless of our gender, race, religion, sexuality, ability, and so on. These include the right to life, the right to fair trial, freedom of speech, freedom from torture, rights to health, education, and an adequate standard of living. And I have the strong belief that respect for human rights is a necessary condition for cohesive and sustainable communities in which everyone can make a valuable contribution and experience a sense of belonging. Yet reality often falls spectacularly short of these standards, and it's marked with complexities and challenges. I would like, over the next few minutes, sort of touch upon some of these in order to set the scene for some of the panel questions and in subsequent discussion. Now, the first question is, and John sort of alluded to that as well, so why sport? What might make sport a podium for human rights? And if so, what really is the benefit of the value of doing so? So usually sporting boycotts are part of a broader sort of overall package of sanctions, of course, against the country, with the desired effect of damaging a target country's economy and reputation, and ultimately to change a government to change. The appeal of boycotts lies not only in its non-aggressive character, often referred to as soft power or war by other means, but also in the self-satisfaction, I would say, of the countries or sport governing bodies imposing such boycotts, that at least they're doing something and or they're setting an example. So sporting boycotts actually have a long history, and I was maybe surprised to find that the first boycott on record was actually in 420 BC, when Sparta was barred from attending the games at Olympia after failing to pay a fine for breaking the well-known Olympic truce. We've seen many high-profile examples, such as South Africa under apartheid, which was subjected to a variety of boycotts. More recently, Australia joined the United States in a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympic Games by not sending officials to the Games. And as John mentioned, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Russian athletes having been banned from various international sporting competitions. Now, the approach I want to take today is a bit broader and go well beyond boycotts, and to take sort of a broader view of the relationship between sport and human rights. So there are two questions that I would like to raise. How can sport be used as a platform or tool in order to protect and promote human rights? And second, how can human rights violations within the institution of sport itself be addressed more effectively? So it sort of requires us to perhaps be somewhat more self-reflexive and actually turn the gaze back onto our own sporting practices and environments, and to what extent they actually are supportive of human rights in the first place, before and maybe in conjunction with some of the work we do abroad. So consider, for example, various forms of violence, discrimination that we see in sport today: violence against children, racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, and many others. Now, while sporting boycotts are sort of punitive, reactive, and short-term, and John referred to, well, you know, a few years on and everyone seems to have forgotten, what is ultimately, of course, required is a strategic, proactive, and long-term approach to protecting and promoting human rights. Now, let me just say a few words about sport diplomacy, which starts to get more into that sort of area. It's helpful to look at sport potentially as a soft power asset that can play a role in international relations. So some of the objectives of sport diplomacy are to bridge differences across nations, seeking common ground and dialogue, which John Offlow referred to create a platform for example, trade agreements or new legislation, to create a legacy for host countries and improve their image. Now, sporting boycotts can damage a country's symbolic and cultural capital, perhaps more than its economy. I believe this is particularly the case given the immense cultural capital and sort of reputational gain associated with hosting major sporting events. And the irony here is that throughout history, several nations that have been accused of human rights abuses have actually quite heavily invested in what we call sports washing, which is the use of sport to present sort of a more sanitized, friendlier version of a regime. And in my view, this really shows sort of the thin veneer that often characterizes human rights in sports. So how events, athletes, and teams have actually been used to mask or distract from human rights abuses by the very regimes that actually perpetrate those violations. Now, this can take many different forms. So we've seen countries use sport to legitimize their ambitions of sort of neo-imperial control or expansion. We've seen countries channel popular sentiments toward a national sports team in search of legitimacy during periods of political transition or upheaval. For example, during the Arab Spring, Egypt comes to mind here. Countries can turn to their investment in sports to ward off specific threats during times of crisis, This is something particularly that Qatar did following the launch of a blockade against it in the Arab region. So Qatar not only won the right to host the 2022 World Cup, but it also purchased Paris Saint-Germain and became FC Barcelona's first corporate shirt sponsor. Now, finally, countries can use their promotion of sport to counteract international isolation and negative publicity as a way of pursuing legitimacy by other means. So a well-known example is Argentina's hosting of the 1978 World Cup, but also more recently, Saudi Arabia's eagerness to invest in the hosting rights for events such as the Spanish Super Cup, amongst many others, whilst at the same time waging war in Yemen and carrying out a brutal systemic campaign to repress dissent at home and abroad. Now, the sports washing may be seen as problematic, but it's kind of a double-edged sword, because I would argue that in many cases it actually backfires. Sport events can actually turn the spotlight onto domestic human rights issues challenging a nation. So while sports washing can have a degree of success in the achievement of specific aims, without exception, their utility is limited, even from the perspective of countries trying to, if you like, clean up their image. If not internally, i.e. their domestic sort of image and domestic support for the regime, then at least externally. So the thin veneer of legitimacy that sports washing can provide will ultimately inevitably show cracks that reveal the persistence of systemic human rights issues. Now, a good example here is the Lgbtqi activism surrounding the 2014 Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, Russia. Where activists from across the globe protested the draconian laws in Russia. And this actually magnified the light being shone on human rights abuses in the country, and actually also became a bit of a catalyst for the resurgence of activist networks within Russia. So it's actually quite interesting how the hosting of an event as a form of sports washing can actually, in a way, at the same time, put the finger on it and sort of, enlarging the cracks showing, and therefore creating opportunities potentially for change. We've seen a similar pattern of media spotlight and grassroots activism at many sport mega events, from Brazil to China to Qatar. So, for example, Qatar's hosting of the 2022 World Cup has exposed once and for all its inhumane treatment of migrant workers, with at least 12,000 migrant workers having lost their lives in Qatar since preparations for the World Cup commenced. And this again sparked a global campaign, including with very powerful reports and sort of evidence gathering and dissemination by, for example, Amnesty International. So change there is still to be seen, but at least there is much more attention and spotlight being shown on these issues, which potentially could be seen as a first step towards change. Now, much of the discussion about sport and human rights focuses on the international stage and what happens abroad, be it Russia, Qatar, Afghanistan, or elsewhere. Now, what I would like to do for today is also invite us to turn the gaze back onto ourselves. As I said earlier, human rights violations happen systemically within sports. One only has to basically look at sort of daily news for that, and much closer to home than we might want to admit. So they occur across the entire sport participation spectrum, from elite to grassroots, through discrimination, exclusion, and violence. So I encourage us to take to heart the notion that the practice of sport is itself a universal human right, as the Olympic Charter dictates. So participation in sport is recognized in internationally ratified declarations and treaties as a human right that every individual must have the opportunity to engage in. Again, this notion of sport as a human right is rarely fully recognized and implemented in policy and practice. And I think a good example there is the European Sports Charter, which acknowledges both that particular right, but also urges governments to take much more sort of proactive strategic steps towards ensuring every individual has the ability to participate in sport, and ultimately to develop values-based sport, which is seen as a precondition for maximizing the individual and social benefits of sport. So a key challenge then is how to better harness opportunities to promote human rights in and through sport. And at the micro level, how can we better support issues of equity and inclusion in sport as a basic human right in our own local communities, right here in basically in our backyards? So in conclusion, I've sort of briefly outlined some of the aspects of the relationship between sport and human rights, sort of stretching it well beyond boycotts. I really look forward to today's panel debate and hope to be able to contribute to that around how sport can be of service to human rights and how the so-called power of sport is actually not a given. It's something that we have to proactively and strategically work towards together. How can we leverage sport to advance human rights objectives in the first place? And what are its complexities and its limitations? And as John referred to earlier, where do we draw the line? What might that look like? So on that note, I'd like to pass the baton to Professor Hans Westerbeek, who will moderate the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramon. That was a roller coaster ride through a whole variety of angles and viewpoints that we can take in regards to sport and the relationship to human rights. Once more, welcome to you all. It's great to know, not necessarily to see you all, but to know that there's hundreds of you there with us again for the seventh National Sport Integrity Forum. We're very excited to be presenting this forum to you with a stellar panel who can actually talk to this particular issue from not only many viewpoints, but also many platforms of experience. I briefly want to mention the broader context in which sports finds itself and acknowledge the fact that Australia, as one of the first nations around the world, has actually set up an organization that specifically deals with the very broad and hard to pin down define issue of integrity in sport, Sport Integrity Australia. And also that we as a university have partnered with them to develop a short 3-day course managing sports integrity for all appointed and to be appointed national sport integrity managers. And the reason why I mention this is that why is there a need to set up an organization that specifically deals with the integrity of sport? And the answer is pretty simple, because sport is experiencing yet another value explosion, I would call it, one that has been initiated by the digital transformation of our world, of our living environment. And the immense platform that sport actually presents to engage with that digital transformation and digital multiplication, if you like. There's so much money, so much resources going into sport that it also attracts all kinds of devious behaviors that try to manipulate sport in maximizing those resources for either criminal or shady means. So in that regard, Sport Integrity Australia is a leading initiative, not only in this country, but probably globally. So with that, I guess, contextualized remark, I would love to introduce our panelists, because they've been, eagerly awaiting to be visually revealed to you on this online platform, of course. But more importantly, to share their thoughts with us. And our first panelist is known to us all in many different ways. And for a long time, the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove. Sir Peter served as the 26th Governor General of the Commonwealth of Australia, knighted in 2014. And following his retirement in 2019, he was further honoured as a Commander of the Royal Victorian Order by Her Majesty the Queen. In retirement, he's actively involved with defence, health and other charitable organisations, including serving as chairman of Biz Rebuild, the Business Council of Australia's Community Rebuilding Initiative, following the 2019-20 bushfires and more recent floods. Sir Peter is also an avid sports fan with a particular interest in rugby and cricket, and still hopes to be selected, maybe just in time for the World Cup Rugby later this decade. I would also like to introduce Dr. Shane Gould, AM. Shane actually obtained her Doctor of Philosophy at our university, Victoria University, in 2019, studying the culture of swimming in Australia. During her research, she identified that athletes representing Australia on national teams are expected to be de facto ambassadors, a politically diplomatic role, but without the necessary training for it. Sport and politics are supposedly separate. However, Shane takes the school of thought proposed by Jonathan Griggs' 2016 book of sport politics, where sport is political and always has been. Shane does not have direct experience of sport boycotts. She was a competing athlete at the infamous Munich Olympics in 1972. And she brings her academic perspectives with lifelong experience as an elite athlete and role model, and her cultural knowledge to the discussion of today. Then last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Professor Stan Grant. Stan is one of Australia's most respected and awarded journalists, and with wide-ranging experience across radio, TV, print, covering world news and international affairs, and with a strong reputation for independence and integrity. One of his most significant positions was as a senior international correspondent for CNN, covering the rise of China and numerous wars in the Middle East. In 2021, Professor Grant was appointed as the Vice-Chancellor's Chair of Australian Indigenous Belonging at Charles Sturt University, and he's also the Industry Professor at UTS Business School. And he is a proud Wiradjuri man. Welcome to you all, my dear panelists. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. I will ask you separately some questions to begin with. Obviously, our audience is invited to lodge their questions either generically to the panel or individually to you in the chat forum. But we will save those questions until later. And I do know that Sir Peter has to leave as soon as he can. So if you have questions for Sir Peter, put them in the chat as soon as you can, so that we direct those questions to him at the earliest convenience. Sir Peter, I want to start with you. First of all, thank you very much for making time in your incredibly still very busy schedule. You know, you have this unique perspective of the world from the specific position that you have as the Chief of the Defence Force before you became the Governor General. Now, reflecting on Professor Spy's insights from the perspective of having been the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, and as a leader, as probably the penultimate leader, also, you know, from the perspective that we see leadership in defence almost as iconic. How did you pursue, inspire, drive your staff in the Defence Force in particular towards upholding and protecting human rights? So this is a very generic question, I guess. We don't have to talk about sport yet. I want to create that bigger perspective that you can provide us with.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I wanted to say, I wanted to compliment Ramon on his very provocative and insightful mini paper that he delivered to us as part of the introduction to the seminar today. But human rights is enormously important within the military. Even the newest, rawest recruit into the military understands that they're there to protect, and protection, the sanctity of the individual and the community is at the very core of why people join the Navy, Army or Air Force in Australia. And I dare say in most countries around the world, there is this nurturing and protective role, even though it might sometimes vest in the expression of violence. The fundamental objective is to protect. You know, the thing that I focus on is that is when all else has failed and you're using men and women in uniform bearing arms on street corners. And I never saw it applied with more compassion and cheerfulness, and made me very proud than on the corners of the burnt out capital of East Timor in Dili. That was, if you like, the military doing the sort of thing which is a deeply embedded memory for the rest of their lives. But running around using sport at the edge of soft diplomacy. That's what we're talking about, where people, generally governments, decide that individual nations, individual competitors, in the case of Wimbledon on the Russian citizens who play that level of tennis, that's a real expansion of soft diplomacy. Sometimes we might wish we could do it. The Berlin Olympics before World War II, if we'd have been prescient, we'd have sort of maybe not sanctioned having all the nations flock to Berlin. But that's history. Apartheid, we all remember that. And we sort of wish that no country had entertained a South African team that represented an apartheid regime and a regime that was propped up by popular vote. Therefore, there should have been more democracy at play in South Africa. So we can't get away from the fact that soft diplomacy at the edge will include sport. It was have supported Australia's bid for the Rugby World Cup in 2027. That's the men. 2029, the women. We got them in the same meeting, the same decision, and we're jumping out of our skin. Just imagine if somebody took it upon themselves to say, Australia, for whatever offence you have caused, you're not eligible to bid for those. That's what we did to Russia. And that wasn't done by Australia. That was done because the international community, the IOC in particular, said that there'd been some irregularities on the use of performance enhancing drugs, and therefore Russia was not to be allowed to bid for international events for a period of years. And that preceded what we're seeing at the moment in the Ukraine. So there's no getting away from it. But does it work? Is it fair? Now, Ramon, I just hesitate to think how far you could take sport as a human right. There's so many human rights. I don't disagree. It seems illogical to say it's not a human right, but how far does it go? I suppose when governments start plugging in, they say, well, if you're getting our money, that is taxpayers' money. And if you're getting our sanction, that is you go with the full hopes and dreams of the Australian people, and you carry flags and you march onto the arena as form teams, all that sort of thing, all the stuff we love. Then you have to say, well, government gets a say. So this is a soldier saying there's a soft diplomacy part of the spectrum, and sport has somehow irredeemably attached itself there. But does it work? That's the other question.
Yep.
And I don't think it does. Banning the Russian tennis players is dumb. Stopping Russia from bidding for various World Cups and international, that might hurt. Having Russian athletes perform in the recent Olympics, but under more anonymous terms, if I could put it that way. Well, that's all right, I suppose. I'm looking at the practicalities. What does it do? In Australia, I think it's counterproductive.
So that's a wonderful transition to Shane, who can then speak from the athlete's perspective. And going back in time a bit, Shane, if I can take you back to 1972, where you were competing and where there were terrorist attacks, killings happening during this event, during which the youth of the world should come together in peace, during a time when we would not fight with each other, but engage with each other on a competitive stage where sport would be the main platform. The international response later raised the potential of boycotts and actual boycotts of Olympic Games in order to protest for human rights violations. From where you sat during those days, What was your view on sport boycotts then? And have your views changed, also in light of what Sir Peter just narrated?
Yes, thank you, Hans. Look, I was very young and very ignorant of what was going on in the world. I was only 15 in 1972, so I didn't know very much. But yes, I was thrust into world politics at the Munich Games, even though my events had finished. I wasn't affected as far as my performance goes, but as far as celebrations go, it was. So my perspective has changed, of course, because I'm older now. But look, I was first made aware, I'm going to read this if you don't mind, by my parents of sanctions against South African sporting teams in the early 1970s, because I'd been invited to race in South Africa. I very nearly went, but I was just 15, so I took my parents' advice not to go. But yes, as I said, I've also experienced firsthand the Munich Olympic massacre in 1972, which was an attempt to use terrorism to address Palestinian disaffection. It wasn't until I was a bit older that I understood the power of sport to influence government policy, such as apartheid, as Peter mentioned. In the late 1960s, and what had happened then, various international sports federations began to sanction South African teams. So by 1972, South Africa was banned from competing at the Olympic Games. And you see the terms change, so the idea of sanctions and boycotts and bans. So the language has changed a bit over time. So banned was used for South Africa and the Olympics in Munich. The partial boycott, so I say partial because we know some people went and some people didn't, as John has narrated. When Russia invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, it further gave me an understanding of the complexity, as we've already raised, the complexity of choosing to boycott or not. And by association, what is the power of sport to influence human rights? So my position now is more thought through with the benefit of history and critical study. So boycotts, I think, are great to highlight human rights issues, but can't be expected to solve structural, social, political, and economic problems that are the basis of in-country human rights violations. So like Peter, I don't think that they're effective, but I think that they can help in highlighting human rights issues. But the current mode of boycotting is flawed because it hurts the athletes more than anyone. It should be the international sports bodies, for example, the International Olympic Committee, who suffer for not sanctioning countries who violate human rights, not the athletes. So athletes continue, as Hans pointed out, I noted in my PhD study of the culture of swimming in Australia, that athletes, and I've experienced this firsthand as an Australian representative, that I've been asked to be a political envoy, but I'm an untrained diplomat, and huge responsibility and expectation on young people to take on this role without any training. But I say challenge, because the IOC is a big player in influencer in being able to boycott or not to boycott or to sanction or not sanction human rights violations in participating countries. I think that we need to put so the IOC purport to be autonomous, like the Vatican, but and to be autonomous and neutral, but they are not a country, and they're not even a business organization. They're not a corporation. So, but they're claiming neutrality and autonomy. So I say put the onus on national governments, not onto the athletes, and have the national governments agree together to pressure rogue governance, such as we've seen and reported in both FIFA, the Soccer Federation, the International Olympic Committee to stand up to them and say, no, we're not going to accept this rogue governments. You need to be accountable to the international world, to international laws.
So you're moving you shift the responsibility to a national government who might not be involved in governing the sport, but
yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So
well,
so there's an example of the Athlete Empowerment Act of 2020 in the USA, mostly addresses abuse, sexual abuse in sport, in the say in the gymnastics and swimming. We're coming to here, but it also states in that Empowerment Act, it's telling the IOC you can't override our country's laws by self-declared political economy. So I'm saying that the way boycotts have occurred are flawed, but I think that they can still work, but they need to have more international cooperation.
Great. And I would like to come back to that perspective a bit later, at what level influence can be exercised. But this is a great first go at that. Stan, I want to talk to you a little bit more about bringing this a little bit closer to home. We've looked at history all the way back to ancient Greece, the 1936 Olympics and 1936 Olympics and 72. As an internationally renowned and awarded journalist, you've traveled the world and had the opportunity in many different environments, up close and personal, to experience how human rights were either protected or violated. And as a Raju man, you reflect in talking to my country on the hardship, injustice and violence that traditional owners of Australia suffer and continue to suffer, and in particular on this special day. That is an important issue to reflect on. On booing Adam Goodes at the SCG, you said, I can tell you how Adam Goodes feels. Every Indigenous person has felt it. We talk about boycotting sport events in other nations for human rights violations. But where are we at in Australia? If you reflect on some of those statements you made in the recent past.
Hans, let me just start with the topic, and we're asking to boycott or not to boycott. Is that the question? I don't think that is the question. I think the question here is who has rights? This is the question. As Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, said, the right to have rights. Before we talk about human rights, we have to understand where human rights as we understand them have emerged from. It emerged from, particularly post-World War I, that then accelerated post-World War II, from a liberal Western democratic order. Look at the people who constructed the order. One of the people who constructed this global order with the founding of the League of Nations in 1919 was Jan Smuts, who was one of the founding fathers of apartheid in South Africa and a prime minister of South Africa, establishing the regime that would ultimately lead to a declaration of human rights in 1948 after World War II and the United Nations Declaration. So immediately we go to the question of the hypocrisy of human rights, how they are constructed, who constructed them, and for whose benefit. Now, there is no doubt that a human rights regime constructed to represent liberal Western democratic values are going to also excuse or favour liberal Western democratic countries. And we've seen that. We've seen that perpetuated ever since. When we talk about human rights, we're really talking about a market of rights. We're really talking about the capacity to access rights, to have the political power and the wealth to access rights. If you have more expensive lawyers, you can access your rights. If you come from more powerful countries, you can prosecute your rights. If you are from poorer countries, if you are Indigenous peoples, then your access to those same market of rights are limited. Now, one of the things about a UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 is that you essentially draw a line under history. You imagine human rights as being the fulfillment of some liberal democratic neutrality, an idea that liberal democracy in and of itself carries a virtue that separates it from other forms of government, other institutions and other forms of government. But what we're really talking about then is Do we then ignore everything that led up to that? Do we ignore the power inherent in the rise of Western liberal democratic countries? Do we ignore colonization? Do we ignore empire? Do we ignore genocide that was carried out as part of colonization and empire? Does the world start anew after 1948? And they're pertinent questions when you're talking about a country like Australia or talking about a country like the United States, who can prosecute human rights with some degree of virtue and say that we have instruments of law, we have instruments of democracy, we have freedom of expression, freedom of the press, that we have virtues that other forms of government don't have. But what about the legacy of history? And there is no doubt that countries with a history of colonization, the legacy of that history lands hard, and there are unfulfilled, unsatisfied questions of justice that continue. So when the rubber hits the road, and you look at something like the treatment of Adam Goodes, driving an AFL player out of the game because of the relentless booing that he received, or the treatment of First Nations people in Australia today, where we die 10 years younger. We are the most impoverished and imprisoned people in the country, to where access to rights is determined by our capacity and our place in the marketplace to fully determine those rights and politically access them. But none of those things are going to be a barrier to Australia being awarded the Olympic Games, for instance, or the United States being awarded the World Cup, as they're going to be jointly holding a football World Cup in 2026 with Mexico and with Canada. Those questions don't come into play as much as they were coming to play with more contemporary questions of human rights, like China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims, or like the Qatar World Cup, or Saudi Arabia and Gulf, more contemporary issues of human rights that don't necessarily take into account the history and the weight of history and the way that human rights have been violated in the past. So it goes to a question of hypocrisy, and it goes to a question of power. And then how do we apply that, and who carries the weight of that? So if you look at China, for instance, yes, it is accused of carrying out genocide against Uyghurs. It still hosts the Winter Olympics. In 2008, it was persecuting Uyghurs. I was reporting from there, living there in the lead up to that. It was persecuting Uyghurs. It was persecuting Tibetans. It was still awarded the Olympic Games. You mentioned the Nazi Games, of course. We knew what Adolf Hitler was about when the Munich Games were carried out. So there is always hypocrisy in this, and it always reflects the weight of power in the world. Now, who bears the brunt of this? Well, we talked about athletes, and athletes having to be scapegoats, if you like, to carry an onerous load that governments won't carry, that business won't carry, and that athletes have to be more holier than thou. Athletes have to be the ones who are the most virtuous, to wash our own sins through the sacrifice of athletes because they're banned from particular games. So all of this really sets up a very vexed question. Who has rights? Who has access to rights? Who are the arbiters of human rights? How do we deal with those inconsistencies and hypocrisies? What is the role of history? And do we just draw a line on everything and take everything on a case-by-case basis? Or is there some form of consistency that we can apply to who gets to hold events, under what circumstances do we boycott, who's boycotted, and who carries the weight of that boycott? How much of that weight falls on athletes? So I think in a forum like this, we end up asking harder questions because the solutions have been out of the hands of our government. The solutions have not been arrived at by our sporting bodies or our business lobbies. So we're searching around in the dark, and as we know, as we've heard from Peter and Shane, athletes overwhelmingly carry the burden of being more holier than the rest of us and either boycotting games or being banned from games because we don't have political answers to the complexity of our world.
Gee, Stan, that puts a different perspective on things. And I guess you started off with saying to boycott or not to boycott, is that the question? And we didn't misquote Shakespeare. We purposely said yes, the question for a very good reason. Also, I guess your point, and I want to come back to this in another question I'm going to ask you later, but you know, history is unfolding as we speak, right? Russia is colonizing, you know, territory. We have certainly not learned from history, and politicians are not in place long enough to not repeat the mistakes we made in the past.
And even there, Hans, could I just point at this? Even there, that while we are, the West is coming together to, and in my view, rightly, isolate Russia and impose harsh sanctions on Russia. While Russian athletes are being banned from participating in events, even if those athletes don't necessarily support what Putin is doing or even protest what Putin is doing, they are still feeling the impact of that. Even while those things are happening, a country like Germany, for instance, will be arming and helping to fund the Ukrainian resistance, but of course still buying energy, still buying gas from Russia, which ends up ultimately funding the Russian military war machine. This is the complexity of our world. It is not an easy situation where we live in the real world. Before we just move on, can I point out one other example? I think this is a really pertinent one. India, which of course is a democracy, it is part of the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, which is designed to try to push back against increasing Chinese assertiveness and aggression and expansion within our region. But India, of course, is led by Narendra Modi, a man who at one point was banned from entering the United States, has been accused of wrecking democracy in India, whose Hindu nationalism has suppressed Muslims, especially in Kashmir. So with all of the accusations of human rights violations, India is part of the Quad. It is seen as a partner in democracy. And India, of course, is the beating heart of world cricket. So again, power and access to power often determines who has rights, how are human rights viewed, how they're prosecuted, and who do we push back against or not.
Yeah. And so talking about heads of state and where power lies and where decisions can be made, Sir Peter, you were the head of state of Australia, maybe less visible, but certainly very impactful. As the Governor General of Australia, in your position, and let's reflect on some of Stan's observations about where you draw lines. What are rights, and how do you execute rights, and how do you make them, you know, equally accessible to those most in need? How did you use the platform of sport as a means of engagement with local communities, with in your narratives, in your culture building or nation building or identity building of Australians, where sport is such an important platform for unified engagement and pride, and from a head of state perspective, right?
Hans, I've been listening fascinated to Stan's discourse, and I agree with so much of it. Look, soft diplomacy, and I'm including bans, sanctions, boycotts as part of soft diplomacy, because inevitably governments get involved. Even if sporting federations decide they'll do this or that, it's generally not an own motion, and John Bertrand would tell you that. But let's just say that the important thing is there's a new repertoire. Well, two points. First, there's no unlimited human right to sport. Nothing is unlimited in our human existence. If we organise into nation states, then we don't have just 25 million sovereign citizens that, for some reason, must be resourced and must be allowed to do just whatever they want because it's their human right. Human rights are crafted and limited. So I can say, please respect my home, but that doesn't mean if somebody knocks on the door, I can shoot them because they're on my front porch. We understand those limits. So let's just say there are limits to the human rights, even where sports involved. But in Australia, let's go back to square one. We are obsessed with sport. It's part of this, I don't know, national characteristic of continually proving ourselves. We love our sports people. We watched Shane in the swimming pool with verging on however many million people there in love with the woman, because she was a winner. She was trying hard. We were so proud. And it's like the inverted pyramid where the great political power, sporting federation power, comes down and hits an individual in the back of the neck to say, you're not going to be able to compete because we're boycotting against that country. There are other ways, and we've heard some of them from Stan, we've heard some of them from Shane, whereby countries which were looking to showcase themselves are actually not allowed to stage that competition. The other part of the repertoire, which is quite new, is these mass economic sanctions, boycotts, bans, and punitive measures. You know, you look at Ukraine, 44 million people, and Russia a lot more, and Russia predating and all that sort of stuff. And we all know that there's a surprising level of obstinacy and resistance. Now, also behind that is the sanctions that nations are applying, the hardware and software they're providing into Ukraine, but there are the economic sanctions, and some of them are ad hominem. They are going to individuals, bank accounts, and that sort of thing. This is new. We mentioned 1936. It's hard to see how that would have occurred then. It wasn't a connected world as much. So we are seeing other ways of soft diplomacy which sort of push sports as a weapon into the background a bit, I hope. But we also, I acknowledge that there are nations who enjoy sporting prominence through staging international competitions, who have their own raft of injustices occurring. Back to you, Stan. It's a murky world. Australia will never hold itself up as a paragon. I gave the speech which took us onto the Human Rights Council at the UN in Geneva. But as I did so, I didn't shy away from the fact that we've got our own history and we're still a work in progress. We are a very imperfect nation, but there's a lot of nations more imperfect than us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can I just say, I think Peter's right there, and I think this is, you know, we live in a world of moral relativism, and it's difficult to find moral clarity. I think that's the really difficult thing, isn't it? And getting a consistent approach to a moral response to what are human rights outrages and abuses. As I said before, one of the virtues of liberal democracy, for all of its inherent hypocrisy and contradiction, is that there are instruments of politics and law which allow us to prosecute human rights violations, for people's voices to be heard. We can vote, we have freedom of expression, and all of these things mitigate the ability to carry out human rights violations absolutely untrammeled or absolutely, you know, without any pushback. When you're talking about authoritarian regimes, Russia and China and others, where they don't have those instruments of law and freedom of expression and so on, it becomes so much more difficult. And I think we're rapidly reaching a point in our world where, without excusing the history of colonisation, empire and brutality that the West sits upon, that's at the bedrock of its power, the reality is we are in a world now where hard choices are going to have to be made between how do we rehabilitate and resuscitate and maintain liberal democracy in the face of rising authoritarian threat. And those choices mean that things are going to be framed increasingly around hard decisions. And some of those decisions are going to fall very unfairly. And I think this is why we're seeing what's happening with Russians. And I think this is why Russian athletes are being banned en masse, even Russian tennis players playing at Wimbledon, not because they're supporters of the Putin regime, but because in an era of an arc of authoritarianism versus liberal democracy, democracies are saying we must make a send a clear signal that this will not be accepted. And even if individual athletes are caught up in that, it is part of trying to find some moral clarity to push back against brutality in our world. And we're seeing that right now in Ukraine. So yes, we inherit a lot of complicated history. The West does not come to this with clean hands, but we're being called upon right now to try to bring some moral clarity to a morally very murky world.
I agree, yes, and I just say that we must not get into reverse hostage taking.
Exactly.
That's what I'm talking about with these poor old Russian tennis players. Doesn't matter if they think Putin's the greatest person ever; they're just individuals, and I think the world gets the fact that Russia's not doing a good thing at the moment, and to me. I was a little taken by the yin and yang where Wimbledon bans the Russian tennis players and the International Tennis Federation, whatever they're called, say, well, there's no points for Wimbledon.
Yeah. Well, there you go. See, there you go. It's what is a morally clear response to this? We can't even get agreement within sports, let alone governments or trade or anything else. It's very difficult.
And on that, I think you mentioned moral consistency, Stan, and I think it's one of the dilemmas of our time, obviously facilitated by the disruption that digital technology and social media platforms deliver to us, in that even when we think we have a consistent moral platform, the misinformation fed through all those different channels puts people, in opposite positions, all thinking that their moral standard is the one that should be the consistent. So not until we get blockchain delivered decision making, we may return back to some kind of global standards. But and I want to come back to this in my last question to you, Stan, but I want to now take the discussion to the grassroots level and ask Shane in particular, also given your very engaged work with grassroots and children in swimming in particular, and the issue that was raised by Ramon and put in perspective by Sir Peter, universal access to sport. Is it something that we should define as a human right, or at least as a basic right? And how are we doing in terms of Australian kids getting equal access to opportunities to engage in sport, specifically from your experience as an entrepreneur in grassroots swimming? Yeah, just unmute. There you go.
Yeah. Look, I can't speak about all Australians and their access or not to sport, but I will mention two instances. One's about children in youth sport, and the second one is the teenage dropout rate from sport. And I'll do an elbow and say, I'm sorry, I don't know the stats. But look, I'm in two minds about whether sport is a fundamental human right. But I do strongly agree with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child, in which Article 7 states that children have the right to play and recreate. So this right is affirmed by a great organisation called the International Play Association. So what we understand is that children need to play and move in order to develop physically, emotionally, and socially. There's a lot of sensory integration dysfunction because children aren't moving enough at the right times. So climbing, experiencing textures and, tumbling and kicking and getting upside down and being in nature. So children have to play. So I find in schools, I'm coming at this from a bit of a curmudgeonly perspective, because I think sport is a good thing to do, but with reservations. So in schools, there's an overemphasis on theoretical and academic subjects with an indifference to the importance of play. But there are some schools, though, which are great examples, who do value play by using the outdoor classroom for learning through movement and nature engagement. So as long as youth sport is organised and run with play values, then I think sport fulfills the human rights of the child to play. So in Australia, there are many, many opportunities that children have, but there's one thing that's a roadblock to that right. And it's surprising, you might think, that there's this thing called the performance pathways. It's used extensively in Australia for long-term athlete development. Now, it can work for people who, kids who are talented and physically and socially developed. But according to one source, a guy who consults with coaches and who coaches parents and children, parents of children in youth sport, and he says that if a child is not in a junior development program when they're 11 or 12, they have a sense that they're not good enough. They swap sports or drop out altogether. Children play sports for many reasons other than some who like the competition, who are competition oriented. Yep. So they want to be with friends, learn skills, be encouraged, take risks, be challenged, and be part of a community club. So the junior performance pathway program inadvertently interferes with a child's opportunity and their rights to play sport. That's an opinion. But finally, I've had some extended family experiences where teenagers drop out of sport because it no longer meets their meaning to their life or is not relevant to their needs and aspirations. For example, it's quite well known that swimmers, train a lot. So a teenager might be doing 10 sessions a week swimming, but it loses its meaning after a while. But 3 sessions are still very meaningful. But the swimming culture is not set up to cater for these people. Squads like that are rare. Look, I'm all for junior sport for performance, but as long as the children are playful, then the rights of the child are being met. So that's my perspective on what's happening in Australia. And I know it's in some ways it's very insignificant compared with the heady things that we're talking about, but it is the grassroots, and it's where children do learn to play sport and develop the love of moving and fair play and all those wonderful things that they play for and we understand sport is good for. So I think they're barriers and can violate the human rights of a child if that performance is overemphasized.
Well, and thank you, Shane, because I think you hit on a critical point. We don't call it grassroots for nothing. It is the roots of where sport begins, and dependent on how we create and modify a system that primarily focuses on elite pathways, and you're right, the biggest dropouts in sport in our research through our PESI group here at VU and Fed Uni shows that between 10 and 14 and after 15 is the biggest dropout rate in sports in Australia. That's when mass kids leave sport in mass numbers. Also, Australia has a long history from the federal government point of view in over-investing in elite sport. 70% of the federal budget on average has gone to in entities like the AIS in high-performance sport programs. So Stan, I want to take that perspective back to you. We've already spoken about the various events that are coming to our shores. There's also a thing called the global sports arms race, where nations, long-term, but also emerging economies who want to play on the world stage, in particular, some of those with questionable regimes, pump huge amounts of money into sports performance systems to score on the medal rankings. Should we be chasing those events? Should we putting mass amounts of money, federal money, taxpayers' money into elite performance programs, or is it better spent at what Shane just mentioned, modifying the sport participation system in Australia and giving more people the opportunity to play at their level?
Well, Hans, we've already answered that question because we are competing for those events. We are pumping a lot of money into those events. We're about to go into the golden decade, as we're describing it, with the Commonwealth Games and Olympic Games in 1932. We've got the Women's World Cup coming up next year. So we're already doing that. At the same time, we're aware that when we do invest in those events and when we win those events, the investment and the funding does also funnel through to grassroots sport. Part of that is able to be invested into grassroots sport. We saw after the Sydney Olympic Games a spike in participation. We always see those things after we hold big events, and there's so much media coverage around that, and that inspires people. It's good for our health, it's good for our fitness, and that does feed into broadening the base of grassroots sport. So there is a benefit, a material benefit in investing in those big events. Now, in terms of what that says vis-a-vis human rights and other countries that are investing in these things to try to wash themselves clean, if you like, in the sports washing analogy that we heard from Ramon Spy a little bit earlier, that also is a two-edged sword. I mean, one of the things that we do see is that when nations take on big events, even nations with questionable human rights records, it does bring about, in its own way, change. We've seen this in Qatar, for instance. Qatar rightly criticised for its human rights record, its treatment of migrant workers, but it is also ahead of other nations in the region in dismantling the kafala system, making reforms to the kafala system. The kafala system means that migrant workers essentially are hostage to their employers. Once they go to work in a foreign country, they lose their passport, they can't change jobs, they can't return home whenever they are like, they're often underpaid and subject to harsh conditions and so on. Well, Qatar is starting to unwind that now, and that wouldn't be happening if it wasn't holding the World Cup of football. So we also see that. We also see that nations, I mean, let's look at the 2026 World Cup, where Mexico, the United States and Canada are going to be jointly hosting it. Well, Mexico has a deplorable record when it comes to violence against journalists. We talk about Saudi Arabia and the complicity of the state in the killing of the journalist Sochi. There have been 11 journalists killed in the past year in Mexico alone, and yet Mexico is going to be part of that. Now, does that condemn the awarding of that to Mexico? Potentially, but does hopefully some reform come from that, and the spotlight that will be shone on that may bring about some change? Potentially as well. One of the things I've always been really struck by with major events is that they shine a light into a country, and countries change irrevocably, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. 1936, of course, we talk about with the Nazi games, and then a few years later, the world's at war. Look at Seoul when it held the 88 Olympic Games. Rapidly after that, democratizing, growing its market economy. Look at Tokyo, of course, when it held the games post-World War II. It heralded Japan's return to the global order and its return as a leading economy in the world. China, hosting the 2008 Olympics, was meant to bring China closer to the fold, help to bring about reform and change. It actually heralded China's sharp turn to authoritarianism and the return of China as a global superpower. It harnesses attention on a nation. It reveals the best and the worst of the nation. It can help bring about change at its best. At its worst, it can harden authoritarian tendencies. So that's what sport does. It shines a very bright light into a country and reveals a lot. Australia, it challenges us. We're going to have to, part of holding the World Cup of Soccer means we have to hit certain benchmarks when it comes to human rights, participation of women and so on in sport. We're holding the 2032 Olympics will mean that, again, the spotlight is shone on Australia to look at the things we're not doing well, but to do other things better. And then hopefully by doing that, change in that way, we also filter that down to grassroots sport and see an improvement in investment and participation around that as well. But whether we're going to do it or not, we've already answered that question. We already are.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just as a quick note to your statement, the Australian Human Rights Commission has particularly identified the 2023 FIFA World Cup as a wonderful opportunity in terms of human rights legacies for Indigenous partnerships and enterprise,
exactly,
gender equality and racial equality. So, it is also the intent given and supported by the government that hopefully in this case will shine a very bright light on those issues. Yeah. Sir Peter, before you go, I know that you have other commitments, but I just want to pose one audience question to you here. And it comes all the way from Poland. Brett Osler, who's watching online from Krakow in Poland, refers to your statement about Australia's engagement with East Timor. and how sport may or may not play a part in building or rebuilding or facilitating relations and reconstruction of, in other cases, war-torn nations. His question is, should countries bordering Ukraine and Russia look at things from a similar perspective?
It would be lovely to think that that was possible. I think as you're in Krakow in Poland, you'd understand the visceral, almost inherited concern that countries have towards recidivism and revanchism between countries that have been at odds over centuries, eons. And it's not necessarily communism, it's not necessarily democracy, it is deeply held estrangements. I'd love to see sport as a binding, healing agent. I'm put in mind of when Russia and Hungary played water polo in the Melbourne Olympics in the 50s. And whatever it wasn't water polo. So I guess I would say broadly, sport is the way to introduce nations to something of peaceful contest, which we love. And it is in the DNA of Australians to revert to sport, to say, we're in the way of socialising the two national communities involved. But particularly in Central Europe, it's more difficult. It's seen as a moment of truce, not truth, truce, T-R-U-C-E, rather than the first step of normalising and getting amiability. Every modern declared enemy that Australia has had is on the way to being a friend. You think about it, Turkey, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the list goes on. Vietnam, they are now one of our stronger developing friends in Southeast Asia, and that list goes on. So it's all right for us, but there are communities where it's really difficult. I saw this when we had the Kosovars coming here. I was in the military then, Kosovar refugees, and to talk to some of those folks, some of them were temporarily housed on my military base where I was in the Hunter Valley, and to talk to those folks, the ones who could speak enough English for me to get on with them, it was just so embedded in them, the hatreds and the estrangements. But if there's one thing that we should persist in, it's the peaceful coming together of the human instinct for competition with rules. That's the sporting field.
So Peter, thank you so much. I know that you will have to leave us a little bit early. So I just want to briefly intermit here and thanking you for your amazing contribution, for making the time. And we hope that, we'll see you back at the 2027, 2029 World Cups. Maybe not as a player, but certainly as a big supporter.
I think I've done my dash as a player. I want to leave all our attendees with just this one thought. Those wonderful athletes who represent this country in any discipline, any sport, they have this wonderful sunburst, brilliant genius ability that lasts for a small number of years. And it is desperately sad when we ever interfere with the opportunity a brilliant Australian has to show themselves off and garner that acclaim that comes from competing at international level. So to me, sanctions, bans, boycotts, last card in the pack.
Thank you so much. And I will take that opportunity to ask another audience question, which is very much related to your final statement, Sir Peter. Thank you. Jocko Callahan comes to us asking that the panelists infer historical boycotts as government-driven, But current circumstances are forcing sport as a sector to take a position. Does the panel agree? Shane, I want to go to you first. In other words, is Swimming Australia more than the Australian government being forced in a position to say yay or nay and to either advise their athletes to go or not to go?
This is there's inconsistencies, and like John Bertrand said in his introduction, that there's different there's country to country, there's athlete to country, there's governments to countries, governments to sports, sports to sports. It is complex, and look, I'm sorry, I don't think I've got much more to say, you know, or to comment on that. Just that it's darn hard. You know, it's very, very complicated, and you know we need to expose the hypocrisy, face up to it, and you know, develop moral clarity and moral consistency. And if that means, you know, the swimming organisations or the national sporting organisations take the lead, and then the governments follow, well, that's how it will have to be. So it's just sort of what happens, you know, in a moment in time, and it might be different in 5 years' time. So I think if there's an opportunity there to make a protest, and it has to come with the leadership of the sporting organisations, well, they just have to do it.
Yep.
Hans, I think the evidence shows us that yes, it is falling to sporting organisations, and within organisations themselves, it's falling to different events, as we've seen with tennis, to come up with their own response to this. So you have something like you know, Wimbledon banning Russian athletes, but then the Tennis Federation downgrading the Wimbledon tournament because of that, and essentially saying it's now an exhibition tournament and doesn't carry the same points that would normally be carried. We saw that with the Novak Djokovic thing in Australia as well, where suddenly tennis was front and centre. They wanted to let him in, the government intervened, and there was this struggle over who would prevail. And was it sports domain? Was it government's domain? Was it the federal government? Was it the state government? This is where it all becomes incredibly complex, and the inconsistencies when we live in an interconnected world where the biggest engine of economic growth in our world is an authoritarian regime, China, whose great friend Russia is invading Ukraine, and we all have to trade with the likes of Russia and China. It is so complex. And then we distill those complex decisions down to sport, to sporting organisations, and expect them to have answers that governments don't have. And as Shane said, you know, if it falls to them, they have to bear the brunt of this. Can I point out something else too? This is another conundrum for sport. If we're moving into this world of where we boycott or we make decisions about who can and cannot play sport based on the human rights records of their particular countries, even if they're individuals not competing in their national colours, what about the question of sporting individuals wanting to express a political point of view? What about at the Olympic Games, which are meant to be political free? We remember that great image of Tommy Smith and John Carlos from Mexico Olympics, where they ended up losing their careers and being run out of the sport because they dared to stand there and make a righteous display of protest against the treatment of African American people. And would that sort of thing be allowed now? Because if we're going to be making moral judgments about what is in and what is out and taking a moral stand against human rights, what about within sport and within sporting events? And where are the rights of individual athletes? They want to stand up and make that statement. If the Olympics were being held right now and an individual Russian athlete, not even wearing the Russian colours, but competing individually perhaps, or as a refugee in the refugee teams, wanted to stand there and make a public display against Vladimir Putin, would they be banned? Or will they now be allowed? And if they're allowed, where do we draw the line as to who gets to express a political point of view at a sports event? This is a Pandora's box we open, and it has unforeseen consequences.
And that Russian athlete making that statement wouldn't be able to go back to Russia.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I just want to ask Ramon as he kicked us off, ask him one question. I know that we're running slightly over time, but I just want to give you one question, Ramon, maybe also to offer you an opportunity to summarize a few things. But Tracy Holmes is asking, do we really care of individuals? Or do we use them to dress up political and personal biases? And she points to the example of, since the Beijing Winter Olympics finished, few have mentioned hashtag where is Peng Shuai, you know, the Chinese tennis player. So is it a dress up exercise in political and personal biases, or do we really care about human rights of individuals? As a closing statement.
Just to further that metaphor with the Pandora's box, I think this is very much part of that inconsistency. And I think Stan opened with, you know, the hypocrisy of human rights and who has rights sort of at the deepest level. And I think it shows here that ultimately, I think it is much of a dress-up game. And I think a really interesting case, different example, is Mo Salah, who got dragged into, paraded out, right, as some sort of patron of the Egyptian regime, and he got completely caught in that game. I think what the example from my homeland, the Netherlands, I think that is really came to mind here for me, is also if we talk about sort of sports governing bodies and sport organizations taking the lead on this, and you know, and may perhaps, you know, having a more morally consistent response. What happens when that actually affects the bottom line, i.e. medal chances, performance? And Hansi referred to the voting arms rate. So the Royal Dutch Football Association just had a bit of an incident where they initially banned all their national teams to play against both Russia and Belarus. Belarus seen as a supporter of Russia in the war in Ukraine. And when they figured out that the Dutch national women's football team would most likely miss out on the World Cup qualification because they would forfeit the match against Belarus, whereas the other countries were still playing Belarus, they decided to sort of downgrade the boycott to only Russia, restricted to only Russia, not Belarus, because, you know, heavens forbid we miss the World Cup, you know, qualification. So again, you know, all these consistencies and complexities and hypocrisies. In other words, you know, yes, we're serious about human rights unless it hits affects our bottom line, right? Our chances of winning medals, and so that, you know, that's further illustrates. So yeah, the evidence, to go back, sort of, is that in many cases.
Well, on that note, Ramon, and I know we can debate this for probably a few more hours. The time has just flown by so quickly, I cannot believe it. I think rather than summarize the very rich and varied discussion we've had, I think the ultimate summary is that a mirror is the most important tool that we need in order to self-reflect individually, as organizations, as politicians, as leaders, as nations, to what we actually mean by protecting and facilitating and ensuring that people have human rights. A discussion that certainly went a lot deeper than only talking about sports as a frivolous activity that we happen to engage in a friendly, competitive way. It once again showed that the platform of sport has amazing opportunities, but also incredible pitfalls, if you like. I want to thank our great panel for their amazing contributions: Professor Ramon Spy, Sir Peter Cosgrove, Dr. Shane Gould, and Professor Stan Grant. Thank you so much for your wonderful contribution to yet another National Sport Integrity Forum. As of course, these events never happen without great collaboration. So I would also like to thank our topic working group members, including Sport Australia, the Australian Sports Commission, and a special mention to the Sport Australia Hall of Fame team for all their work. John Bertrand, as always, not only contributing to, but insightful contributing to the discussion. Adrienne Sarkozy, Bonnie Elliott, and Shane MacArthur at the Office of Sahov from Victoria University. Natalie Zebeck and Jasmine Canizzo behind the scenes, absolute driving forces to making all of this happen. The team from MSL Production for the technical support today. All of you, 300 or so online, and many who will watch this particular recorded session again when it's all posted on various platforms in the near future. I lastly want to thank all staff and colleagues from my university, Victoria University in particular. And just a little plug for those of you who are looking for further engagement in the whole business of sport area. We do run a Master of Sport business with a specialization in sport integrity. So just come and see us if you're interested. On that note, a very successful 7th National Sport Integrity Forum is done. Panel members, much appreciated, and hope to see you all soon. Stay safe, but increasingly face to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.